morning, everybody. Welcome to the second panel of our morning, our second and last panel. So we're talking about smarter sentencing, which is something that obviously Sir Robert has just been talking to us about, and a really, really interesting panel. I know some of the discussions and some of the topics that were discussed in the first panel, I suspect, are going to raise their head again. So we're going to look at ways to transform sentencing, including through, of course, the government sentencing bill, which I'm sure is front of mind for many of us at the moment. And we're going to look, of course, at reducing reoffending, which is something, as Police and Crime Commissioner, I really, really care about. And we do an awful lot of work in Surrey, and I know that colleagues like Chris from Gloucestershire and others are working very, very hard on it as well. So I'm Lisa Townsend, I'm Surrey's Police and Crime Commissioner. One of my roles as Police and Crime Commissioner is that I chair the Surrey Criminal Justice Board, which is going to make this seem like an absolute piece of cake, I suspect, because nobody here is going to be asking me for money. So that's something. So we have on the panel, first of all, Gareth Bacon. Gareth is Minister for Sentencing. He's been Minister since November of last year. And before that, of course, he was on the GLA as well before becoming an MP. I have to my immediate right Ed Arger, who was appointed Minister of State for Prisons, Parole and Probation in November 2023. And before of that was Chief Secretary of the Treasury, Parliamentary Under Secretary of State for Justice, Minister of State for Health and Paymaster General. And Ed and I have worked together during his time as Minister for Victims as well. So I'm really interested to hear his thoughts on that. To my far left, I have Penelope Gibbs. Penelope is Director of Transform Justice, who are an excellent organisation to my mind, set up in 2012 and has really worked around social change and an awful lot of issues in that space. And I'm really, really interested to hear what Penelope has to say about things that we could be doing differently as well, because I think that's going to be incredibly important, because we do feel like we've been talking about this subject for decades now, and I'm not sure how much is changing. And then finally, to my left, I've got George Grant, who is, of course, Chairman of Tempus Novo, a position that he's held since 2016, a prison charity based on getting offenders and ex-offenders back into work, something that we touched on, I know, in the last panel, and something that I'm really interested to hear more about as well, because I think this is something that absolutely goes to the heart of how do we treat people, what is prison for, and how should we be dealing with them afterwards as well, making sure that they can live full and fulfilling lives in our communities. First of all, I'm going to ask each of the panel members just to speak for just a couple of minutes, talk about the area of what they're working on at the moment, what they're excited about, and what they think that we can get out of this discussion. So I'm going to start, Gareth, with you.
Well, thank you very much, Lisa. My name is Gareth Bacon, as Lisa just said. I'm the Parliamentary Under Secretary of State at the Ministry of Justice. Primarily, my responsibility is on the sentencing bill and sentencing policy, as well as illegal migration, electronic monitoring, the prisoner, escort and custodial services, statutory instruments, and transparency. I'm the lead minister for the sentencing bill, and I listened carefully to Sir Robert, I always do, when he was talking about smarter sentencing, and that really is the purpose of the bill. Since 2014, we've seen a very great number more people going to prison for longer. Sorry, can you not hear me? Thank you. And I think that most people would welcome that. However, we also have a very large coterie of people that go to prison for very short periods of time. And that has a knock-on effect in terms of the reoffending rate. If you send people to prison for a very short period of time, you dislocate them from the very things that are likely to prevent them from reoffending, such as family, employment, and relationships, and often their home as well. So what we're looking at doing is trying to reduce the rate of reoffending, as well as using our prison real estate to the best possible impact, and that's what the sentencing bill seeks to do.
Thanks, Lisa. I'm Ed Arger. I'm the Minister of State for Prisons and Probation, as you said, and have held a number of roles in recent years, some of them in rapid succession, in the course of 2022. But I emphasise the fact that I'm the Minister for Prisons and Probation because they are two sides of the same coin. And as Gareth has highlighted, yes, we want people, and it's right that they pay their debt back to society when they offend. Yes, it's right that we protect society through custodial sentences where the crimes are of a seriousness that is necessary. But it's also right we reduce reoffending, because fewer offences committed, fewer additional offences means fewer victims, linking back to the portfolio I worked with Lisa on in previous years. And we've seen reoffending come down from 31% to about 25% in the past 10 years. That's progress. But on the point that we ended the last session on, much done, much more to do. So it's absolutely right that our prisons play a key part in that reducing reoffending journey as well. Gareth talked about the moves to focus more for crimes where it's possible with tough community sentences, because we know, as he said, a short custodial sentence is long enough to dislocate people from often the few things that give a degree of stability in their lives, but not long enough to actually make a real difference in prison in terms of education, in terms of tackling substance misuse, in terms of employment skills and a whole range of other things. But it's right that those community sentences are tough, but give that wraparound support. But it's also right that in prison, when people are in prison, we create the conditions that allow us to equip people for the day when they are released, to give them the options to make positive choices about how they go forward. Now, we all know the challenges and the pressures we face in our prisons estate in terms of capacity, and people may want to ask about that in a moment. But what we need to create, and what we're working to create with the investment in new prison places, is an estate that is capable of allowing people to rehabilitate, to make those positive choices, and to acquire the skills and the support they need for when they leave to lead a productive and law-abiding life.
Thank you. I'm going to be controversial here and say that smarter sentencing sometimes doesn't involve sentencing at all. If you look at reoffending and the Ministry of Justice statistics, in fact, the best reoffending rates are for cautions. Those are sanctions given by the police out of court. The people are not prosecuted, and they can give them for a huge range of crimes. And can I just say that Lisa's area, Surrey, is the star area on this one. Surrey uses these out-of-court resolutions resolving crime out of court more than any other police force in the whole country. And that means that is effective in terms of reoffending. Yes, court has a place, but it has to be always acknowledged that in the magistrates' court, most people who are convicted get sentenced to pay a fine. That is not rehabilitative. It's not even says it on the tin that it's rehabilitative, but that is what magistrates' courts do. So we need to use magistrates' courts, for the right cases, not ones that could be dealt with out of court. And then when we get to prison, it has the highest reoffending rate of all. And again, prison has its place, but are we overusing it? There's a College of Policing report which came out in December, which is really interesting, which was a meta-analysis of over 100 studies looking at the outcome of imprisonment. This is people being sentenced to prison. And under every single measure, prison increases offending. So for a similar crime and a similar person, these meta-analyses published by the College of Policing say that if you send that person to prison, their reoffending rate is likely to go up. Now, obviously, some people, notwithstanding that, still need to be detained for our safety. But it comes back to the short prison sentences, totally and utterly useless in every way. And totally supportive of the government to try and, basically not use those, because, as I say, the reoffending is increased if you use a short prison sentence. I hope that they get their legislation through with as few caveats as possible. But another thing I'd just like to point to in terms of rehabilitation is that this legislation, if it gets through, still won't help with one aspect, which is criminal records. So our criminal records checks, we need them, but they are massive state overreach at the moment. Too much comes up on criminal records checks, on DBS checks, which prevents people moving on in their lives, both people who've left prison and those who haven't. So 1 in 6 people in this country has a criminal record. Most of those didn't go to prison. Unfortunately, everybody who has any period sentenced to custody or a suspended sentence, if they have a standard or enhanced DBS check, it will come up on that check 1 week in prison or any suspended sentence the whole of their life. It comes up 30 years later, a suspended sentence for something that they did maybe when they were 18. So if we really want to produce a game changer to rehabilitation, we should look in detail at our criminal records checks. And I just want to say that we issued 7.5 million DBS checks in 2022. That is just a reality check about that system.
Okay, we may not, I think as PCCs know, we've just been through the re-vetting for police officers. I think there's an interesting debate there around how much the public want to know or we need to know about people. And last but not least, George.
Thank you. So I'll try and keep this relatively short, and then hopefully we can elaborate more in the Q&A. The obvious question, I mean, if you want to be reducing reoffending, is asking, well, why are people offending in the first place? And I'm probably going to just preach to the choir and teach all to suck eggs, because we all know the answers to that. Yes, there are people who are inherently bad, and they exist, and when they commit crime, they need to go to prison. There are people who commit crime in a fit of passion, the heat of the moment. They do one thing stupid one time. But a huge number, and I would venture to say the majority of people who are in our prisons are there because of the life circumstances that they were born into. So you all know the figures. More than 50% of people in prison are functionally illiterate. 76% have got 2 or more identifiable mental health problems. And, you know, it should come as no surprise that the rate of offending in the most deprived neighbourhoods is over 1,000% greater than in the most affluent areas. I mean, you know, the figures do lie, but I think those figures don't lie. And so when people are coming out of prison, right, well, what can we do? And I think what Penelope said about the criminal records checks and DBS is extremely important. And it's how can we help people to take ownership of themselves and to have, you know, a stake in society. And when you look at the program that exists, the several programs that exist, we've got this education, training and employment. That's the sort of the keystone thing. And so the focus on education and training is absolutely right, because, as I say, if people are very unqualified, if they're not reading well, you know, if they haven't had a job before, then that's all marvellous. What I would like to see is, the problem is really the third element of the ETE, it's the employment. And how can we integrate models that have been shown to work for supporting ex-offenders into employment, into the government, you know, or the state's programme. And the work that Tempus Novo does, you know, I will expand on it for those that, you know, later on. But I think it has been very successful on a local level within Yorkshire and the wider region of taking ex-offenders and supporting them into employment. And it's not just because they're cherry-picking and taking the soft options. Like 30% of the guys on our books currently are PPOs. But the model does work, and it works at a local level in a non-government enterprise. And what I want to explore is, well, how can you then take the model that works and integrate it into an institutional framework? Because I think that would make a very significant difference indeed.
Thank you very much. Gareth, I'm going to come to you first with a question. We've just heard an awful lot about shorter sentences. We've talked a lot about shorter sentences. Within the bill, which we all hope will get through, how are you going to align those goals of reducing reoffending with the fact that we need to put the most dangerous away for their protection and ours? And where are we going as a party and a government on this?
Well, we're going to attempt to do exactly what you've just suggested. So for the worst offenders, we're going to be toughening up the sentences. So we're going to be making whole life orders the statutory or the presumption where somebody kills one person with a sexual or sadistic motive. The whole life order will now be the starting point. Previously, that was 2 people. Rapists and serious sexual offenders will now serve every single day of their sentence in prison rather than spending part of it out on licence. But at the other end of the spectrum, what we are looking to do with short sentences is we're going to introduce a presumption to suspend sentences of less than 12 months, subject to a number of carve-outs. So, for example, if an offender, if there's direct harm or prospect of harm to an individual, so he may be somebody who's a domestic abuser, for example, they would be outside the presumption to suspend the sentence, and that is to protect the individual that they are a risk to. If they are a repeat offender and they are within the court system already, so if they're serving a community order or if they're on a suspended sentence already, or indeed if they are on bail, they will be outside the presumption. So we're not mandatorily scrapping short sentences, we are introducing the presumption to suspend. And judicial discretion is important here as well, because ministers are not subject to every case that goes through the courts. The judiciary are, and they have all the facts in front of them. So there will be exceptional circumstances in which the judiciary could set aside the presumption, but that will depend on the evidence presented in court.
Thank you. Penelope, suspending sentences of less than 12 months, is that the answer?
I think it is absolutely the answer. I just hope that those caveats that the Minister has just discussed don't actually, in the end, mean that it doesn't come into practice. Because what this was introduced in Scotland, a presumption against short prison sentences, and it hasn't worked that well in terms of, one thing one has to watch out for is that we don't set people up to fail. So if they have programs or appointments that they need to go to as part of their suspended sentence, they ought to go to them, obviously, but these people often, people have addictions, they have chaotic lives and so on. And so what's happened in Scotland is a lot of people have what's called breached. They haven't necessarily committed another crime, but they haven't turned up to an appointment. So I think that this needs to be done with compassion, understanding, and support for those who are on those suspended sentences.
Yes, just to come back on that, thank you very much, Lisa. What we're not trying to set anyone up to fail. To reassure everyone in the audience and indeed on the panel, the reason we are doing this is to try to reduce reoffending. And what we are looking to do, where suspended sentences are served in the community with conditions attached, we know that the reoffending rate is significantly lower than if they serve a short period of time in prison. And we're increasingly using technology to enforce this. So the range of electronic monitoring equipment that we now have, for example, we can use GPS tagging to enforce curfews, to know where people are at any given point in time. For those people whose offending rate is due to alcohol abuse, we can introduce alcohol tags up to 120 days. And those have proven to be exceptionally effective, something like 97% effective in terms of keeping people away from alcohol. So what we're trying to do by introducing the presumption to suspend short sentences is to give people a chance to contribute back to society, to undertake their treatment for whatever drug abuse they may have or mental health issues they have in the community, rather than having to go and serve time in prison. But it's a chance that they need to take. So we're offering them the opportunity, but if they do reoffend, then of course there is every chance that they will hear the clang of the prison gate.
George, setting people up to succeed and not fail has got to be where we've got to start, hasn't it? And where does your organisation see itself then fitting from a wider point of view within this? Particularly when we're looking at scrapping of short sentences, does that not give you a sort of larger cohort then of those who've committed more serious crimes, obviously?
Well, I think the cohort is already enormous. That's not the problem. On one level, there is the PR battle that is to be fought. And, that has changed in recent years. I mean, when David Cameron, a Tory Prime Minister, back in 2015, remember that, he said that, ex-offenders were an opportunity to be harnessed as opposed to problem to be managed. I think that signalled a sea change. And 45% of employers, I think, now would be willing to take an ex-offender, at least in principle. But I think this whole thing around soft on crime, hard on crime, is a complete, it's a problem, because you've got to get people beyond that to say, look, it doesn't matter whether you're soft on crime or hard on crime. The current state of affairs is utterly nonsensical for you as a taxpayer. You are paying, as taxpayers, we are paying £18 billion a year. It's just an eye-watering amount of money. And when you say to people that, I ask people this all the time, how much do you think it costs to house an offender in prison for a year? I don't know, 10,000, 20,000, you say, it's 47,000. I say, you can educate a boy at Eton College for less than it costs to send someone, for a year in His Majesty's Pledge. I mean, that's just completely bonkers. It doesn't make any sense. And when you can say, look, it's in your economic interest to deal with the problem, quite aside from whether it's better for the offender, for victims, obviously, it's better there's fewer people offending, but for you as the taxpayer. And I think in terms of how you can help ex-offenders, work is undoubtedly the biggest thing, because it is the catalyst for self-respect. And to be able, if you come out of prison and, best will in the world, I'm going to change my ways, I'm going to reform, I'm not going to get back into crime, I've got 50 quid. Yeah. And every CV, a la poubelle, in the bin. No one wants to give me a chance. If you can find a way to support someone, to get an employer to say, actually, this person is probably going to be a more reliable employee when they are given a job, which they are, the retention rate is higher than amongst the civilian workforce, for want of a better word, the non-offending workforce. But also, for that person, they've actually got, they've actually got the practical means to support themselves and their family for the first time. And, it's utterly transformational.
I think this is exactly what Sir Robert talked about when he opened his, talking about smarter sentencing and smarter justice rather than the sort of harsh or soft. Ed, you were victims minister, and we've been talking about sort of the importance of sentencing and getting that right. And of course, at the other end of this, there is a victim, which you'll be very aware of. PCCs in the room will be very conscious of it as well. What have you brought from your previous role into this role?
Well, do you know what? You're absolutely right to mention that, and I have to say I agree entirely with what George has just said, because not only is smarter sentencing about giving the right sentence for the nature of the crime, it's about making sure people pay their debt to society, but give them an opportunity to succeed and make a positive life choice. And I think from my experience working with victims previous to this job, but also back in 2018-19, I did get a number of very clear messages from them. There were messages about how the system works, which is they wanted to be listened to, they wanted to be treated with respect, they wanted to know what was going on. They wanted to see people punished and pay their debt to society, but crucially they also wanted to see fewer victims in the future. And that goes to exactly the point that George was making there. Getting this right, preventing people reoffending, means it's not only economically and financially sensible, it's not only better for the offender who actually gets a chance to live a positive life and make positive choices, it's better for victims, because we know if you get this right and you reduce reoffending, it's fewer victims on our street. And I have to say, I've always been amazed and incredibly humbled when I meet victims, and you will see it as a police commissioner, of some of the worst crimes. And yes, they want to talk about the perpetrator, yes, they want to see justice done, but often the overriding thing is they want to see change that means someone else doesn't go through what they've been through. And that's why this focus on smarter sentencing and making sure that both prison, where someone does go to prison, prisons, and then subsequently probation. And we mustn't forget probation in this. It's very easy to talk about prisons. People can see a prison, they know what a prison is. Probation is sometimes doesn't get the same profile, but actually the work it does is absolutely as vital, if not more so. We've got to make sure that both of those organisations, both those parts of the system, are focused on what can they do to ensure that those people in their care, in their custody, are best equipped to succeed in life. And to conclude, exactly going back to George's point, there are a number of things there. Employment is central. Accommodation is central to that. Access to those services in prison and continuing outside that help them get off drugs, get off alcohol and stay clean. All those sort of things are absolutely vital, and we see it in the figures to enabling them to make that positive choice and to sustain it.
Brilliant. And I have to give a shout out actually to Bronzefield, which is in my patch and has the largest female prison estate in Europe, and they do that incredibly well. Right, I'm going to take a couple of questions from the audience. Sir, here at the front row. If you could just introduce yourself and ask your question. And there's a microphone coming, I can see it.
Thank you. Anthony Weaver, Wild Street, Covent Garden Residents Association. My challenge really is for Penelope, and possibly my question also goes to the Minister for Prisons. Any visit to Feltham Young Offenders Institution, or indeed any other prison, would reveal that almost no one is there for their first offence. So typically in Feltham, I'm sure the Minister for Prisons would back me up on this, a young man, young woman perhaps, particularly, no, men we're talking about, aren't we? We are more criminal. The typical prisoner at Feltham has gone through, and his criminal record, to quote Penelope, will reveal this, a whole number of cautions, plus community orders, possible probation. So he is in Feltham because he has committed numerous offences. It is not his first offence. So I challenge Penelope because her offer of her backing for cautions actually involves lying to people. I believe a caution is administered by a police inspector, am I right, not sergeant? And the wording is that if you do this again, something will happen. Any glance at a criminal record appearing in a magistrate's court every day, just check with the clerk, any clerk at Westminster Magistrates Court on the Marylebone Road, will show you that the defendant has already been given numerous cautions. So what you are doing when you say, if you do this again, something will happen, you are lying to the person. And that's treating them as subhuman.
Okay, so we get the flavour of your question, I think. I'm going to let Penelope answer first, and then I suspect both ministers actually will probably have something to say, and George may as well. So, Penelope, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, I sat as a magistrate myself in Highbury Corner Magistrates Court, so I saw those records as well, and I do know that out-of-court resolutions are used more than once. But what I would say is there is absolutely no evidence that harsher criminal sanctions are a deterrent. And sometimes you need to try again with people. Obviously, at a certain point, people will go up the ladder and go into the magistrates' court, and they might get to prison. But the fact is we now have a massive range of rehabilitative programs which are not available at the lower levels of the magistrates' court, available to police. So in Surrey, for instance, there's a range of programs for people who are addicted to drugs. There's what's called, for women specifically, out of court, which offer support about those issues. And I would say the people in this country who have a long record of offending, in the end of the day, you have to look at their housing, their education, their mental health problems, and somehow we need to have a system where those drivers to the crime are addressed so that that person is not offending again and again. Just sending them to Feltham is not going to resolve that issue. Obviously, we need prison for people who are dangerous to society, but the majority of those who enter prison on sentence are entering for non-violent offences, and that doesn't make much sense in terms of reoffending.
comes back to Sir Robert's point earlier about all parts of the system being parts of the criminal justice system, education, health, the whole lot. Ed, do you want to, and then maybe Gareth on sentencing?
Very briefly, I may, because I think your question, you were talking about Feltham there, and I've been to Feltham. I also know your residents' association. For 10 years, I was a Westminster City Councillor, which covered part of Covent Garden. So I remember back in the day the community activity there was there. And Feltham is a complicated establishment because it's got the under 18s, it's also got the 18s plus. So it's got a mixture of people in two different parts. And I would say to anyone who thinks that prison, or the narrative we sometimes see in the press and elsewhere, prison is a soft touch, it really isn't. Anyone who's been inside a prison knows it is not a soft touch. But you asked specifically, and I think you were talking specifically about youth offenders, really, that younger cohort. And I recently went and sat in a youth court observing justice, and I think a key point we need to make here is we treat people under 18 in the criminal justice system, as in other aspects of life, differently to over 18s because they are still little children. And therefore, it's absolutely right that those, and I look at the cohort in our youth offenders institution, a lot of those in there, yes, some of them are exactly as you say, people who've committed multiple offences. Others have committed a very serious, violent offence, be it a murder, be it a stabbing, be it a vicious assault, and they're in there for a reason. And I know that the way magistrates and sentencers approach those under 18 is to say, do I need to send this person to prison? Is there an alternative? And sometimes they'll conclude there isn't, because the crime is so serious they've got to go to prison or it's a repeat crime. But what we've seen since 2010 is actually around a 70% reduction in under 18s in custody. It's down to about, and I may get my figures slightly wrong, about 450 days. So we have seen a real effort over the past 12, 14 years to say, is there another way? Is there another chance we can give someone? Is there another route, including obligations, including things they've got to perform, tasks they've got to perform, including treatment or help they've got to get, that will say, this really is a last resort, sending someone under 18 to custody. And that's why we've seen those numbers come down. But what we see in those 450 or so, as I say, we do see people who've committed repeat offences. We do see people who've committed very violent offences. But the vast number of people who come into the criminal justice system, be it at the police end or up to a magistrate's court, a youth magistrate's court, don't get a custodial sentence. And many of those do not come back into the system because that approach works. So I suppose what I'm saying to you, sir, is there is no one size fits all, but where the crime is sufficiently serious or where people do constantly reoffend, even if they're under 18, they will go to prison. And when I look at the 450 and what they've done and who they are in there for very good reasons often in terms of the nature of the crime.
Ellie.
Thank you. Ellie Vasey-Thompson, Deputy Police and Crime Commissioner in Surrey. I just firstly wanted to say to the gentleman on the end of this row that as lead for children and young people in Surrey, which borders with Feltham and where most of our young offenders would go, I'm actually delighted that hardly anybody there is a first-time offender because I'm pleased that our children and young people aren't going to prison for their first offence. But what I actually wanted to ask the Minister about, I was at HMP Highdown yesterday, and we were talking about some of the brilliant work that they're delivering with prison staff. And we can only deliver effective rehabilitation in prisons with excellent staff. One of the challenges they've faced recently is that where prison staff are being assaulted, the convictions aren't really being treated seriously. And we had a similar problem in policing, which was sort of resolved by some brilliant legislation earlier this year and some nationwide work to improve convictions for assaults on police and emergency workers. Is there something that can be done to help support prison staff so that we don't end up in an even worse case of being able to recruit prison staff across the county and country?
Yeah, thanks, Ellie. And first of all, thank you for the work you do in Surrey. And actually, I should say thank you for the work you're doing with Highdown at the moment, because if I recall, I think you're, and the Commissioner, are doing a lot of work to tackle drones with the prison there. And of course, that links into what you're talking about, because one of the factors that drives assault on our staff in prisons, and I put on record now my gratitude, they do an amazing job day in, day out, often in tough conditions. And while we recognise, because we see them around about, the amazing work done by our emergency services, police, fire, ambulance and so on, I don't think as a society we always recognise the amazing work that police officers do because they're working inside prisons. So I just want to put that on record. But the reason I pick up on that drone point is because one of the things that drives violence, prisoner on prisoner, prisoner on officer, are illicit substances, drugs, illegally distilled alcohol, phones coming into prison, a whole range of things. That's why there's a multi-pronged approach to this. One of them is we've got tougher with scanners at the gate, with more searches to stop that contraband getting in. The work that Lisa and you and others are doing with prisons to tackle drones. But also, and we're seeing this in the increased officer numbers, we're seeing it actually in improvements in the retention of prison officers, because it's great to have a lot of new officers coming in, but I really, really want to keep the experienced officers as well, because those who've served in the military or in the police will know you need those experienced NCOs, those experienced officers who can teach the new recruits who are fantastic how to actually do the job in practical terms. So that helps improve safety. But where those assaults happen, and I'll be very honest, there are too many of them, day in, day out, and we need to do more to tackle that. But when they happen, we need to make sure we go after those prisoners, and they need to know there is a consequence, and for those assaults where it's serious, that includes more jail time.
Thank you. Another question. The gentleman here at the back, sorry, in the middle, the red sweater.
Hi, my name's John Sampson. I work for a social enterprise called Skills Builder Partnership, but I'm a former prison officer at HMP Pentonville. Really welcome the short sentence reduction and all of that legislation. But my feeling and experience is that sending people to prison for longer is challenging because the prison environment isn't truly set up to support and develop people to turn their lives around. And I guess my question is, what are we going to do to improve the prison environment to make it a truly developmental space so that we have less victims in the future? And yeah, that's the challenge. For context, I worked in a prison of 1,200 people. I worked in a prison of 200 people. Be no surprise to hear that the prison of 200 people was a far more effective space. So what are we doing to make those spaces more rehabilitative, smaller, and supporting staff to actually be able to do good work?
Okay, I'm going to start with Ed on that one, I'm afraid, but I am also going to ask colleagues to my left as well what they think we can be doing in prisons.
Well, first of all, thank you for the work you did as a prison officer, and thank you, crucially, for the work you do now, because they both play into actually helping rehabilitate people, give people those positive life choices. And I was in Pentonville a few months ago, and one of the challenges I saw there, which in a sense I think you were alluding to, is in the nature of those old Victorian buildings, it makes it harder for you as an officer or as someone going in with a social enterprise to have the space and the facilities and the time to actually do the rehabilitative work that you want to do. It's one of the reasons why we are investing in new prisons, and they're designed based upon research from across Europe to be modern spaces, safe, but also fit for that rehabilitative work as well. But I have to say, when I go around the country and I talk to officers, they don't universally condemn some of the Victorian prisons. They say they'd like investment in them to improve the maintenance and similar, but the sight lines are very good. The design actually from a security perspective is functional, but what they don't have is necessarily those purpose-designed spaces to allow for rehabilitation out of cell activity. I was in HMP Leicester last week. They do a fabulous job, and they have a most amazing library, but it's a library from 2 converted cells, I think, in the basement. They've made it fantastic, but they're working within the constraints of the environment that they have there in that prison. So we've got to invest in new designs. We've got to invest in the maintenance for the prison estate we've got. We've got to invest and continue to invest, as we have done, in recruiting more and retaining more prison officers and prison staff, because if you've got that ratio right, it's easier for those officers to spend more time actually engaging in rehabilitative work rather than just focusing on the security and stability. And finally, the other crucial point is, and we've sort of alluded to it a bit here, and George has touched on it a little, is partnership working. It's not just about the amazing work the officers do, it's about working with organisations like Tempus Movo, like the National Literacy Trust, the Shannon Trust, all these different organisations, the Twinning Project, bringing football clubs into prison, all these things, when partnerships are formed, actually help not only the rehabilitation within the prison, but also that journey and that continuous journey to the outside, where those partnerships are still there and able to help people who, when they're released, need that support in those initial months and beyond. They're the crucial elements of this.
So George, making prisons fit for rehabilitative work, what are you seeing? Are you seeing good examples? I'm sure you're seeing bad ones, but...
No, I'm seeing, well, I mean, so well, first of all, I'd like to say thank you for what you've done.
So our two chief executives at Tempest Nova are both former prison officers from Armley Jail in Leeds and various other prisons across Yorkshire. I don't claim to be an expert about the inner workings of the prison estate, so I'm not going to presume to do that, save to make a couple of observations. The first is I suspect that there is something to be said for the broken pains theory, which is that the more you can clamp down on the little things, the better, the better placed you are to stop the big stuff from happening. And when you give up on the little things, that's when the big things become more prevalent. I mean, the prison with which I have the most involvement is HMP Hatfield, just outside Doncaster, not London, for the benefit of this audience. And the governor there is a chap called Nick Mills. He is, I count him a friend. He's a very, very intelligent and enlightened man. And yes, it's a Category D prison. So on one level, you'd say, well, it's on the better end of things for this sort of thing. But forgive me, I don't mean to put you on the spot. What are the number of assaults across the prison estate per annum?
It's a very good question. Give me 2 minutes and it will come to me.
It's all right.
George.
A huge
Keep
number.
Talking, George. I've got a decent memory.
A huge number. So at Hatfield, I mean, the reason I want to Mick told me that it stands in stark. There hasn't been a recorded assault at Hatfield now for nearly 3 years. Not a single one. I mean, that is utterly extraordinary. And the two things are, firstly, he's got an absolute, his focus on, it's one strike and you're out. You make one mistake and you are back to closed conditions. And, I had 8 guys from HMP Hatfield working for me over the Christmas. My day job, all sorts of things. But anyway, we have a huge number of Christmas trees that we need to get shipped out across the country, and we use, amongst other people, serving offenders from Hatfield. And one morning, a chap didn't turn up. He'd done something, I don't know what it was, back to closed conditions. But fundamentally, the big thing is that the reason that prison is so successful is that 60% of the prisoners are out on work. So they're released on license. They are working, and Tempest Nova, we place a huge number of them. But essentially, the guys in that prison have got a real incentive to actually knuckle down and focus and not do silly things, even minor infractions. But that's not a solution across the your Category A's and B prisons. I appreciate, but. Where you can do that, I think Hatfield really is an example for others to follow.
And then just very quickly, the answer, in terms of proportion, is 300 incidents per 1,000 prisoners. Now, we've got around 90,000 prisoners. You can do the math on that. And it went up by 14% in the 12 months to September of last year. So we are seeing that. Now, if you're, as you're rightly highlighting, George, in the prison you're talking about a reduction or very, very low levels, that highlights what's happening in the rest of the estate. So there are clearly lessons to be learned from prisons such as that, and from governors in terms of how they do this.
Yeah, and I have to say policing as well. Policing has a really important role to play here, and I do think even my own force, we're not always doing as much as we can to support prison officers in our prisons. I'm going to take a couple of questions from this side. Lady here, just behind the camera.
Hi, good morning, afternoon. Hi, my name is Delvally Willie. I'm a law graduate, and I have a few concerns, really.
Can we keep it to a fairly short question?
Yes. One of my colleagues, her son was involved in domestic abuse situation, and he went to prison. But the lady withdrew the statement, and he's still in prison, almost going over a year. I mean, the Minister of Sentencing talk about shorter sentencing. I would like to see a more robust, system of transition in terms of dealing with prisoners, and also Penelope talk about the caution. I mean, another lady, sorry, make it short. She hit her child when the child was small, and for that reason, there's a caution on her DBS, and for that reason, it disadvantaged her from getting jobs. So I just want to see the implementation of the caution in be more transitional into terms of Parliament, acknowledging the caution in terms of putting it forward in introducing the sentencing bill to make it more, what should I say, globally, so that people can understand more about the caution, because a lot of people maybe don't implement the caution in terms of their sentencing. They just take them straight to prison. So I just like to see more implementation of the caution instead of taking them to prison.
Okay. Penelope, do you want to talk about cautions?
Can I say caution short even of going to court? It's delivered by the police out of court to people who will admit the offence, and it has to meet certain criteria. But unfortunately, our criminal record system is such that even something which is delivered out of court can still come up on your criminal record 30 years later when you didn't even have any legal advice in the beginning, when you accepted that caution. So we have a movement to try and reform criminal records legislation, and one of our asks is to say that caution should not be automatically disclosed on any DBS checks. That doesn't mean to say that the police couldn't use the intelligence which is on their system to disclose in what are called enhanced checks, which are the top level, but we're saying that cautions shouldn't be automatically revealed, which they can be and are the whole time. So I would completely agree with you. They are a really good option, but they shouldn't have the sting in the tail of 30 years later coming up on a DBS check.
Gareth?
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. So the issue of cautions, obviously, it very much depends at the point of decision around whether to prosecute. So it's very much a police/CPS decision on whether to issue a caution or whether to uprate it and take the case to court. Now, they would only do that if they think that there's a reasonable prospect of conviction. And of course, I can't comment on individual circumstances, so I'm afraid I can't comment on that particular case. But in general terms, I mean, the courts have the full range of powers at their disposal in terms of how they punish people. But that would obviously be dependent on the evidence that is presented to them.
Great, thank you very much. Question from the lady with the blonde hair towards the back and the glasses.
Hiya, thank you. So I'm Shirley Riley. I'm director for Bounce Back, which is a London charity that works both inside and outside of prisons with employment, training and education. So great to hear the panel there. There's a couple of things that I think are challenges that I'd like to kind of hear your thoughts on. One of them, as a member of an EAB in Pentonville, for example, there's well over 70% of people in that prison that are on remand. So I'm interested in your thoughts on what that looks like for the system, because clearly some of those people won't be charged, so I think it speaks to both conversations. And I think the other thing that's striking is, and yes, I agree that more community sentencing is the way forward. However, we know that there's already a strain on probation and there's shortages in the workforce. So how we strike that balance so that behaviour change is at the top of the agenda there.
Thank you. Do you want to start with the question of how many prisoners are on remand?
Yeah, well, I'll do that, and then I'll touch on probation as well, if I may. So in terms of remand, and I mentioned I've been to Pentonville, and I met with the IMB there as well as with prisoners and staff. Now, what we've seen since the pandemic is that the remand population, and these are rough statistics, has gone up from about 9,000 to about 16,000 prisoners. That's a significant increase. It's not the only driver of the increased pressure in prison capacity, but it's a big one. Causes, part of that is down to COVID, part of that's down to the bar strike and the delays that then pull through into the court system. I've got to be a little cautious here, which is, of course, the decision to remand someone, a sentencer will make that decision, and as a minister, it won't be for me to question that decision by the sentencer. But what I think is important for us is that we give those sentences in that first instance the options to, if they wish, choose not to remand someone, but to bail them. And a key element of that, for example, is sufficient quantity and spread of CAS accommodation, the supported secure accommodation, where, because many of these people will be remanded, in some cases because of the seriousness of the offence and the risk of a future offence, absolutely right. In some cases because of a fear that they will interfere with a witness or with the case. In other cases, because they just don't have a fixed abode, or the sentencer isn't confident, they know where they're going to be and there's a risk of abscond or just them moving around. So it's important that we do, as we are, what we can to invest in more community accommodation, in more of those secure, what used to be called bail hostels, but to give sentencers that option. I can't prejudge whether a sentencer will make that choice, but we've got to make sure they feel they've got the options to do that. Alongside that, of course, and you'll have heard this morning from Mike Freer as Courts Minister, the work we're doing actually to get cases through the court, because that's another key element of this. Some of those people will end up back in prison because they'll be convicted, they'll be sentenced, and they'll still have time to serve. Some of them will be found not guilty and will be released, and some may be found to have served the time that the sentence would have been, even if they're found guilty, during their period on remand. So it's important we work through that number, both through the work in the courts, but also in the first place by giving sentences alternatives, because if I'm being honest, that's better from the point of view of justice. It's also better from my perspective in terms of helping manage capacity pressures within prisons. On probation, very quickly, because I can see the Commissioner sort of glancing at me anxiously. Probation do an amazing job. Their workload is high, but we are investing £155 million to get there's 4,000 new probation officers in training coming through the system at the moment. That's hugely important. That will see the caseload coming down. We've got to retain them as well, the experienced officers. And alongside that, the work I'm doing with the Secretary of State is looking at the work that those probation officers actually do, and are there changes we could make? Because if the work is contributing either to rehabilitation or public safety, those tasks are important. But are there tasks we're asking them to do that don't really meaningfully contribute to those? And we're having a look at that.
Very quickly, Penelope, please.
I'll be really quick. Something's going very wrong with remand. So people legally should not be remanded unless there is a real prospect of them getting a custodial sentence. But of those remanded by magistrates' courts and tried in magistrates' courts, 2/3 of those remanded do not go on to get an immediate custodial sentence. So we need something to look at why that decision-making is going wrong.
Brilliant. Right, thank you, everybody. Thank you very, very much for coming. Thank you to everybody on the panel. I think it's been a really interesting conversation. We could probably have talked all day. And thank you to all of you for your brilliant questions.